I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Oh, so first of all, for people who haven't or following in the text of the Lam Rim by Lama Tsongkhapa, we're on page 285. Maybe I'll make a few general. I was actually thinking maybe I'll step back from the text just for a moment to make a few general comments on the section we're on, which is, and we're in the section. We're near the end of the text actually, and we're in the section on a section on emptiness. And this is actually this. I was thinking a little bit about Lama Tsongkhapa recently because in a couple weeks, I think it is 2 or 3 weeks, is the 600th anniversary of his passing away. So it's like. In the Tibetan tradition, they're Tibetan followers of Lama Tsongkhapa. And Lama Tsongkhapa was the teacher of the first Dalai Lama. Right? So the Dalai Lama's tradition. Actually, it's only Dalai Lama says he grew up mostly studying the texts of Lama Tsongkhapa. And this section we're on actually, this book in general, Lama Tsongkhapa wrote it late in his life. And this section is particularly famous, actually, this section on emptiness in this text is one of, they say there are like 5 texts on emptiness that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote that clarified his view of emptiness, and this is one of them. I'll just say that, I was Thupten Jinpa, the Dalai Lama's translator, who also runs he runs a number of different projects. One, is I think called the Compassion Institute, or Stanford. He's connected to Stanford University. He's connected to a number of universities, the Mind and Life Institute. He runs a science project on the benefits of compassion scientifically. He runs this huge publishing project, right, the Library of Tibetan Classics, where they're publishing this whole library full of translations. Remarkable person. But anyway, he recently just published a biography of Tsongkhapa that he wrote. But anyway, one thing about Lama Tsongkhapa is I'll just say, particularly about this topic of emptiness, he was a great, as a young man, he was actually one of the greatest young scholars of Central Asia. He was kind of like, I'll make a point though, in Central Asia, at that time, and still now to some extent, at least in Tibetan culture, a great I think this is kind of funny, right? A great philosopher in Tibetan culture is kind of would be a great football player in America. It's who's the hero of your culture, right? I guess who would it be? Great actor? I don't know what. Who do we everybody's oh wow, that's really important. I got to see so and so. I guess a movie star or a football player, maybe in America. But in Tibetan culture, it would be a great. That's why it's always the Dalai Lama, right? Or when Lama Zopa Rinpoche went to Tibet, people would come they're not allowed to talk to him, right? Because he's not what do they call it? Under Chinese rule, you're not supposed to go talk to somebody who respects the Dalai Lama and who respects Tibetan Buddhism. And people don't care. They just come running. Thousands of people come running to his car to just have him touch their head. So that's like that, right? It's what Americans do for Brad Pitt. I don't know who's popular now. I'm not sure. What's that? I'm too old. I'm saying Brad Pitt. He's old. He's an old guy now. I don't know who's young. I'm not sure. But anyway, so Tsongkhapa was like that. He was like this amazing philosopher. Right? And he had studied emptiness with the greatest teacher of his time. But he said, like, I'm not satisfied with my understanding of emptiness. And so then he went and studied with other teachers. And then he went off and did 4 years of retreat, like where he stayed in caves for 4 years, just meditating for 4 years. And then at the end of his 4-year retreat, he said, I've generated bodhicitta, but I'm still not satisfied with my understanding of emptiness. So he kept studying and doing retreats. And my point is like, he wanted to come, what's sort of say, right? He insisted on coming to a definitive understanding of emptiness. And this is his explanation. Eventually he had this experience, they say, like, actually this experience, did I say that? I don't know if I told this story already. Like he had the experience, he spent like, decades and decades, right, meditating on emptiness. And he'd have these he'd have these experiences that were famous, actually. Like, he was sitting in a temple, a Buddhist temple, and they would be doing chanting and meditating on emptiness. And he would enter some kind of meditative absorption, and all the other monks would get up and he wouldn't move. You know, and they would bang things, he wouldn't, like, he was in a deep meditative absorption where even if you made loud noises, he couldn't be disturbed. And finally, like, you know, like he would sit there for hours and hours in this meditative absorption. Finally somebody would maybe shove him or something, he would get, but he was like, oh, but that wasn't the final view. You know, and then he would have some other experience, like an epiphany. And he would say, wow, he had some kind of transformative experience. He would say, that wasn't the final view. Then he started having visions of Manjushri, and then one day he said, I had this experience that was related to emptiness. Is that the Prasangika view or the Svatantrika Majamika view? And Manjushri said, it's neither one. You're not there yet. You know? And he kept practicing and practicing. And finally there was one night where he fell asleep after studying, after meditating, I guess it was, on emptiness. And he had a dream. And in the dream he saw the greatest masters. He was like in a Pure Land of Maitreya, Buddha, right, Tushita Pure Land. And he saw the greatest Indian masters of emptiness teachings, Anagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, I guess Aryadeva was there. And they were all in a Pure Land, and they were talking about emptiness. And he went over. He was like, well, I'm not going to miss out on this conversation. So he went over, and they say Buddhapalita, who they said people say Buddhapalita was a very tall, dark-skinned Indian scholar. And Buddhapalita got up, and he picked up his copy of his own text, which was his own commentary on emptiness. And he came over and he blessed, in Tibetan Buddhism, like sometimes you put something on top of your head to bless you. So he took it and he blessed Lama Tsongkhapa, and this experience of bliss, like, shot through Tsongkhapa in the dream, and he woke up, and he was still experiencing bliss, like that. And while he's in the state of experiencing extreme bliss, somebody comes and knocks on his door. And he goes to the door to see who it is. You know, he was in a hut, I guess, meditating. And he goes to the door, and this guy's there, and he says, I brought you a copy of Buddhapalita's commentary on emptiness as a gift, and I've traveled so far to offer it to you. And so he accepts, of course, the text, right? And he's like, I just saw Buddhapalita. He blessed me with this. So he opened it up, and he starts reading the text. And I guess he came to a line that said, the self is not the same as the aggregates, nor is the self different from the aggregates. And he stopped and entered meditation, and he realized the final view of emptiness at that moment, directly, I guess. He said, I think he said something like it was like being struck by lightning. That's his description of the experience. Anyway, so these texts that he wrote then are explanations of that, of like his, what's the word? Not just of his study, of that, but also of his inner experience. I guess that's my point. Does that make sense? And so I'm saying all of that partly because it's just true. It's true of Tsongkhapa, but partly because now in this section that we're on, now I'm connecting it to what we're up to. He's talking about, like, the section that we covered last time we had a class on this topic was somewhere where he was pointing out that what he's talking about is valid cognition. And actually, so valid cognition, actually, right, in Tibetan, there's in Sanskrit rather, there's term pramana. Like, if you've studied sometimes, like, great treatises, there are these texts called, there's a whole like, what's the word, genre of literature called pramana, which is like, in English we would call it, I guess, like, epistemology. It's about how do you know what you know. Does that make sense? How do you know that you know something? Which is a question we often don't ask, is it? But these great masters asked that, because they said, like, well, if you don't know that, if like, there are many things we think are true. Actually, it's just true in ordinary life, isn't it? There are many things that all of us think are true that aren't true, aren't they? Then we find out it wasn't true, right, afterwards. So how can you know something definitively, right? And then they point out there are two, actually I'm going off on a tangent here, right? But one way of knowing something definitively is direct perception. Whereas if you actually perceive something directly, like, you know, like in other words, if I say I'm holding beads in my hand, that's a direct perception, right? And that is, what's the word? That's one form of valid cognition. And another is valid cognition attained through reasoning. Does that make sense? And if your reasoning is correct, then your perception is correct. So what he's getting at here is, how do we know what we know? And can we know it definitively? So in the previous, the one we covered last time, section, he was talking some about how do we know that conventional phenomena can be validly perceived. Does that make sense? Conventionally existent phenomena. You know, which are what? Like ourselves, right? Our body, our mind, the things around us. How do we know when that's correct, right? And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, some people in Tibet said, well, because everything's empty, there are no valid phenomena. You know, like, what's the word? All external things don't really exist, for example. Right? And Lama Tsongkhapa said, well, they don't ultimately exist. Right? They're not truly existent in some existential sense, but they do exist, right? And they can be validly perceived. And there are things that are valid cognitions of those external phenomena, for example, and they're invalid. Does that make sense? And we can differentiate them, which is quite important in our world now, isn't it? Because there's a whole question of like truth, right? Is there conventional truth? And Lama Tsongkhapa came very definitively and said, yes, there's conventional truth. It's not just anything goes. If you say, there's a famous Tibetan thing, right? If you say that rabbits have horns, for example, no, that's not true. That's a famous example they use. They said, goats have goats have horns, but rabbits don't. You know, and we can differentiate that. Does that make sense? And that's a valid conventional cognition. Anyway, so he was getting into that. In this section, this next section, he's getting into, so that is there a valid cognition of the ultimate truth, right? Emptiness. Does that make sense? So I'm just giving an orientation now. So we're getting into that. And I'll just share something before we get into, like, there are many quotes, and Lama Tsongkhapa is going to give some of them, that people in his time, and in our time too, actually, if you go and study, if you just buy books or something, there are people who present these views still, that he's refuting. Does that make sense? And there were in his time too. And he's raising them, and actually I think it's quite understandable, because I'll read two quotes, I'll read one just. This is a famous, there are different translations of this one. The way it's translated here is, seeing without seeing is the most excellent seeing. Or, not seeing is the best seeing. It's actually a quote in Buddhism. Right? It's a quote from a sutra. And so some people would read that and they would say, well, actually, so what does that mean? Actually, pause for a minute, right? So not seeing, I'm going to just say it that way. Not seeing is the best seeing. Right? Here's another quote that's similar to that. And this one's from Chandrakirti, actually. So Chandrakirti asks a question. Is the ultimate, is such a nature, meaning the ultimate, this is on page 285 actually, so is the ultimate truth, is the ultimate nature not unperceivable? Therefore, how do they perceive it? And then he answers, that is true, that is indeed true, that it's unperceivable. However, it is said that they perceive it by means of non-perception. Now one point is, if you read some of these quotes, right, you could think, well, that's just paradox. And it's some people, you could reasonably see how somebody could read it. One is somebody could read that and say, well, then there is no seeing the ultimate truth. So you don't see anything. So you don't see it. So it's just a mystery, right? That's one way of reading that, right? And you can see how somebody could read it and think that, right? Somebody else could read that and think, and actually, like sometimes, what's the word? When Western writers wrote about koans in Zen, they kind of said this, like, it's a paradox. And it's supposed to sort of exhaust your mind and you'll sort of go to some non-conceptual state, and that's the ultimate thing, right? They would think, well, it makes, sort of this paradoxical statement, and if you think about it, you'll sort of get confused, and your cognitions will sort of exhaust themselves, and then you'll enter some kind of, what's the word? Non-conceptual state, and that's the ultimate truth, maybe, right? And you can see how if you read a quote like that, that's a way a person could think about it. And I guess Lama Tsongkhapa, maybe early in his life, had those experiences of sort of things like that, anyway. But he's saying, what he says is, here, what he's saying, we'll go through it carefully in a second, but what he's saying is, that's not what those quotes mean. And if that's what some other person means, that's fine, but that's not what Chandrakirti meant, that's not what the Buddha meant, that's not what Nagarjuna meant. And then he's going to explain what they meant. Does that make sense? Okay. So I just wanted to, but you can see how somebody could think that though, right? Because these quotes are not easy to understand. And that's why, by the way, I'll just make one last comment, the general comment before I get, now then I'll start the text. I remember I was in, oh gosh, maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I was in India. The last time I was in India, I was at some teachings by Swami Siddhartha where he was teaching in part, he was partly teaching this text, actually. And he said, he was saying that like he himself, and Lama Tsongkhapa also, and the Dalai Lama follows Tsongkhapa in this way, that he loves studying the great works of the Indian masters, Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, all those teachers. And then he said, but they're hard to understand, and so he gave advice. He said, if you read the 5 great treatises of Tsongkhapa on emptiness, then you'll know how to read those other texts, because he guards you. Tsongkhapa explains to you how to understand them correctly and how people can misunderstand them. He said, so if you read those first and then you read the works of the Indian masters, that will be very effective for your meditation. Where he said, otherwise you may make the same mistakes past people made of misunderstanding them. Does that make some sense? Because they're not so easy to understand, because they say these paradoxical statements which have an intent. But if you're not the sharpest faculty person like Tsongkhapa was, and even he took years to understand it, then it's hard to understand. So he was saying, so as long as I said from his own experience, it was helpful to read these commentaries by Tsongkhapa and then go and read those texts, and then the meaning would dawn in one's mind. It was kind of so anyway, okay. So here we'll start on the bottom of page 285. So and the heading is setting out an objection, right, and rejecting this objection. So here, an objection always, when Tsongkhapa says that, you probably noticed this, those who have been here, right? When Tsongkhapa says that, what he's doing is he's sort of, which many Buddhist authors do, when he says setting an objection, he's sort of creating, in his text, he's creating a character in a way, right? Who's sort of saying something like, hey, I think it means this. And always, whenever Tsongkhapa does that, that character is always wrong. Like, if you study Chandrakirti, he does the same thing, and Aryadeva, they all do that. It's a very common technique. And what they're doing, though, is they're setting that up. It's not just to, like, what's the word? Knock them down. It's ultimately, in one way, it's like, it's not just to insult somebody, right? The person who's raising the objection, in this case, you could say it's probably Tsongkhapa at an earlier time in his life. And it's also other philosophers, and it's also for us. Like, it's also a part of us that doesn't understand it yet. Does that make sense? So he's like raising an objection that oneself might eventually have, and then showing why it's wrong so that you don't make that mistake. Does that make sense? So it's not just, that's an important point, it's not just for like philosophical disputation or something. It's that in your own inner experience, as you meditate and study, you'll come across, you'll give rise to these ideas. And so he's saying, I'm going to raise them for you and then show you why they're wrong so that you don't make that mistake. Anyway, so this person, the person who's objecting says, or raising a question says, if the Buddha's exalted wisdom, knowing the mode of being of phenomena, finds ultimate truths, right? So he's saying if a Buddha understands the ultimate truths, right? If his ultimate, or her, ultimate exalted wisdom, right? Knowing the ultimate truth, then how about the following statement from Chandrakirti's explanation of Commentary on the Middle Way? And that's where he says that quote I said. Is such a nature not invisible or unperceivable? Sometimes they translate that. Therefore, how could they perceive it? And then Chandrakirti answers, that is indeed true. However, it is said they perceive it by means of non-perception. Then Tsongkhapa says, it explains that not to perceive anything at all is to perceive suchness. As a source for that, Chandrakirti quotes an explanation that ultimate truths are beyond even the objects of omniscient exalted wisdom. He also explains that the level of Buddhahood, the movement of the mind and the mental factors has permanently stopped. And at that time of the 10 powers, when a Buddha does not perceive aggregates and so forth, he knows all phenomena. How are you not contradicting these explanations, right? So that's the objection. Does that make sense? That's the person objecting. He's saying, and it's quite an interesting argument, isn't it? He's saying, on the one hand, even Chandrakirti, right, who's the greatest, they say is the greatest explicator of Nagarjuna's teachings on emptiness, says this point. Like what? And if you think about it, right, there are a couple of points he's making. One is, the ultimate nature is unperceivable, right? So how can it be perceived? Even a Buddha can't perceive it. Then also they say a Buddha perceives, has no movement of the mind or mental factors, right? And he's saying, well, so Buddha doesn't think anything then, right? Buddha's kind of like this person would think, well, that must mean the Buddha's like spaced out or something, right? In some kind of state, which actually all kinds of people think that though, in one way, right? Like sometimes we think that. I like the way Bob Thurman says it. He says sometimes Easterners and also Westerners. It's not it's common to both, in other words. But so it's not just. I mean, Tibetans even thought this. Many Western philosophers think this. That emptiness and enlightenment are some kind of escapist fantasy, right? That you escape into some state where you're just sort of like in nirvana. You don't have to worry about anything, and you're kind of somehow separate from the rest of reality because it's suffering, right? And so he said, so this objector is sort of raising that, which anybody could think at a certain moment, like it's like you could think, well, I just want to escape from all this, and enlightenment must be that. It must be an escape into some other separate state where there's no mind, and there's no mental factors, and where one doesn't perceive anything, and it's kind of an ultimate people think that, right? Nirvana is a kind of nothingness, right? Which is not Tsongkhapa's view, obviously, but this objector is kind of raising that question. So now Lama Tsongkhapa gives an explanatory answer. This is so typical of Lama Tsongkhapa, right? The person raised an objection. Now he gives, here's my explanatory answer, and this has 15 points, which is very long. He's like, so you're not going to, if you understand this, you're not going to be confused. Right? I'm going to give you 15 reasons why that's not just one reason, not two, not 7, not 10. So now he gives back that quote, right? They perceive by means of non-perception, right? The quote from earlier from Chandrakirti. And he says, does not refer to not seeing any objects at all. That's really important, right? So they perceive by means of non-perception does not refer to not seeing any objects at all. Rather, it points out that if these objects observed due to the cataract of ignorance exist in reality, they would be observed by the uncontaminated exalted wisdom of an Arya's meditative equipoise. So their suchness or their emptiness is perceived by way of their utter non-perception. This is because if the object of negation existed, it would be observable. On account of its non-observation, the realization of the negation of the object of negation is posited. The meaning of seeing without seeing is the most excellent seeing should be understood in this way. So I want to explain what he's getting at there. Remember we talked earlier about how do you meditate on emptiness, right? And in order to meditate effectively, as the way Lama Tsongkhapa explains it, on emptiness, you first have to understand what he's calling here the object of negation, right? In your own experience, we talked about it, right? So you have to actually check your own experience and identify the way in which and remember he used this term, superimpose, right? So that what we do all the time is we project or we superimpose something onto phenomena that's not there, right? And so, for example, in relation to the self, right? We superimpose that there's a solid, there are many different adjectives that are given. There's gross and subtle. This gross level, you could say that sometimes we impose that there's a permanent self, that there is a solid self, that there's a independent self. And then more subtly, we project or superimpose that there's a self that somehow exists intrinsically from its own side, right? And what he's saying is, first of all, to meditate on emptiness, you have to identify that object of negation, right? Which means what you're superimposing. Does that make sense? What you're projecting onto things. And then, when you meditate on emptiness, you use a reasoning consciousness to realize experientially that superimposition is not real, doesn't exist at all, never existed. It was made up, right? And what he's saying is, so that the perception of emptiness is actually a non-perception of that thing, right? Is a recognition that doesn't exist, and then you stop projecting it. Does that make sense? And so, not seeing that inherently existent self is the supreme seeing. Does that make sense? So it's not that you're not seeing anything. It's actually something very precise, right? You're holding on to and identifying in your own experience the object of negation, and then you negate the object of negation, right? Which means you're recognizing it doesn't exist, actually, that doesn't exist. and in a sense, right, so the idea is that that non-perception is the ultimate perception. Does that make sense? That not seeing of that particular thing is the supreme seeing, right? Because it's seeing the ultimate truth of how you exist. And so now you start to see, wow, like you can get it, right? Even just from that one, that's only the first of the 16 reasons, right? But just from that one, you go, oh wow, this isn't just some weird paradox that Chandrakirti is raising, right? He's getting at something very specific, actually, right? And he's not giving something that's just going to be unknowable in sort of some vague, oh wow, my mind's spaced out. He's getting at, oh wow, the particular non-seeing or non-perception he's getting at is a very specific, right? It doesn't mean blanking your mind out and just like not thinking about anything. It actually means identifying the object of negation, negating it, and the non-seeing of that is a seeing of emptiness, right? Which is a perception, actually, right? Does that make sense, that first one? Okay. Then the second point of the 16 is a source for that, right? So he's saying, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, and Lama Tsongkhapa always does this, right? Actually, he gives sources, and his sources are always, or usually, not always, or almost always, and this one is, from India. Right? He doesn't give Tibetan sources usually. In part because, what's the word, his view is that those are authoritative. Not that he doesn't respect other Tibetan teachers, but he's saying, Buddhism came from India, right, to Tibet. And so so here he's quoting the Buddha, actually, very authoritative. Sorry. So he's quoting the verse summary of the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. So the quote from the Perfection of Wisdom says, "Those who don't see forms and also don't see feelings, who don't see discriminations and do not see intentions, do not see consciousness nor mind nor intellect, see the Dharma. Thus the Tathagata teaches." So first of all, should I keep going? I'll explain that verse and then I'll go on to the next. Well, actually, yeah, okay, I'll say something about that verse at least. So first of all, I want to point out, what he goes through there, right, are the 5 aggregates, right? So the Buddha is listing the 5 aggregates, actually, right? Form, feeling, discrimination, intentions, which is sometimes translated as compositional factors, and consciousness, right? And so he's saying, when you, so what he's saying there is when somebody's seeing, and Dharma means the ultimate truth, right? So what he's saying is when someone sees the ultimate truth, they don't see the 5 aggregates, right? And I guess I want to point out a couple things. One is, there are actually 2 ways to interpret, I think, that verse. So I'm going to say both of them. One is, you could interpret that verse, I think the main way you would interpret that verse is this, is that it's according to what he just said before. In other words, that what you're not seeing, going back to that phrase of not seeing, is that any of those things exist inherently or independently, right? So in other words, that there's a sense in which, and we went through this on the conventional truth, that for ordinary people, whenever we perceive any of those things, we always superimpose a sense of inherent existence. And when one is seeing emptiness, one is not seeing any inherent existence. That's one way of interpreting that. Then there's another way I just want to mention, because it's going to come up more later, is also when a person is in the state of directly perceiving emptiness. Does that make sense? Like a direct realization, not just conceptual, that's beyond the conceptual realization. Also, only emptiness appears to their mind. No other objects are appearing to their mind at that time. Does that make sense? So another way of interpreting this verse is that for the person who's actually perceiving the Dharma, meaning in the meditative absorption realizing emptiness, only emptiness is appearing to their mind. So the 5 aggregates, buildings, houses, people, cars, nothing else is appearing to them at that moment, because they're in a meditative absorption. So those are 2 meanings to that verse. Then he says, sentient beings see space and put that into words. Through that way in which space is seen, investigate this. That's how the Dharma is seen, the Tathagata teaches. Through through other analogies, seeing cannot be expressed. And I'll read the next sentence, and so then Tsongkhapa says, what is not seen are said to be the five aggregates, and what is seen is the truth. That is the meaning of suchness, just as in the statement, he who sees interdependence sees the truth. And so this is an important point Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, and actually the Buddha and Lama Tsongkhapa are both saying space is the only, what's the word? They're actually saying kind of like this. They're trying to describe what it's like to see the ultimate truth, emptiness. And they're saying, space is the only metaphor I can use for this. Right? And why? Why is space the only metaphor I can use? And the reason why is that this is, like, we all, they're saying, for an ordinary person who hasn't seen emptiness yet, we have seen space. Does that make sense? I mean, ordinary people can see space. And he's saying, how do you see space? And you have to check for yourself, right? It was because, like, if you see the color blue on this piece of cloth, you know, your mind is perceiving it, you can perceive it directly. Like we're talking about, like, direct perception, right? You can see that directly. But when you, if you say, I see space, right? Actually, space, according to Buddhist, I've said this before, the way Buddhist philosophy defines space is a lack of obstruction, right? So, in other words, space is, what do you call it? Unobstructedness, right? So, in other words, because the wall is not space, right? But you could say there's space between me and the wall because it's unobstructed, right? And so you see space by not seeing something. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, you know, there has to, like, I'm not seeing anything between me and the wall. So I'm saying, oh, I see the space between me and the wall, right? So it's a seeing by not seeing. You get the point there? And he's saying, and what the Buddha and Lama Tsongkhapa are saying are that there's nothing else in ordinary experience that they can use that serves as a metaphor for this, in this sense, right? That what else is there? That, you know, in other words, they're saying it's hard. It would be difficult to come up with something else where the seeing of it is a not seeing something. But with space, this, when you say, you know, like, so if you say, you know, I remember that, like, I was just remembering, like, as a kid, looking up at the sky. I was with my grandfather. We would look up at the sky, and he would talk about how vast space was. You know, and, like, he would say there are so many billions. You know, what's a light year? He would describe me like, what's a light year, and how many billions of, you know, how many light years there are between things. You know, you get the sense of the expansiveness of space, right? But with the idea, right, that between things, right? So, like, you know, you look and you go like, wow, like, between this and that, there are these many billions and billions of miles, like, of miles or something, right? But the point is like, so between those two things, you're saying the space, at least part of that, is unobstructed, right? And so what he's getting at is, you get it now. So we perceive space by not seeing obstructions. So he's saying, similarly, we perceive emptiness, right, by not perceiving inherent existence. So in other words, when you recognize experientially the lack of inherent existence, then you see emptiness. And that's not, and just like at one point he's making also, so one point he's making is, there are 2 points there that I want to point out, just so you get it. One is, it's a seeing something by not seeing something. That's one point. But the other is, you do see something. Does that make sense? Does that sense? The result is not some vague thing. Whereas when you say, you know, when I think back to the experience laying on the ground and looking up at the sky, there was a perception that happened, right? Like, I was like, my grandfather pointed out, you know, that's space. And I was like, wow, that's space, you know? And there was a perception. And similarly with emptiness, that when you realize the lack of inherent existence, you perceive something, which is emptiness. And you perceive that by a non-perception. Or, does that make sense? Okay, so that's the analogy of space. That's the second point. And the third point. So he's going to get into more detail. Elucidating the meaning of that sutra passage. And actually he's going to say some of what I just said. So more specifically, the imaginative space is the mere elimination, right? That's what, so he's using that term, elimination of obstructive tangible objects. And seeing or realizing it is like not seeing the obstructive objects of negation, which would be observable if they were present. Right? See, that's just what I just said, right? Whereas you can perceive space because you're not seeing any obstructive tangible objects in that area, and therefore it's empty space. Right? What is seen is space, and what is not seen are obscuring obscurations. You see, so that's the point I was making. There's a not seen, which are obstructions, and there is something seen, which is space. Right? So it's not some vagueness. And he's saying the last two lines negate that suchness is seen by the way you see blue, rather in accordance with the analogy, right? So that's what I was just saying. It's not like a perception of some positive, what's the word? Color, right? Blue or yellow or pink or something. It's a seeing by not seeing something. And emptiness is like that. The statement that the five aggregates are not seen indicates then the perspective of suchness perceived by uncontaminated meditative equipoise, other phenomena are not seen. And that's quite an important point that's going to be elaborated more. So I said that briefly, but so for the person who's directly perceiving emptiness, only emptiness is appearing to their mind. And so that's all that meditative equipoise perceives is emptiness. Then the fourth point, which quotes the sutra engaging on the two truths. Explains, I'm going to read the heading here. Explains, in the perspective of perceiving the ultimate with an exalted knower of all aspects, dualistic appearances disappears, but it does not teach the ultimate is not realized. So here I'll read the quote from the sutra. And actually, I don't like this translation. The beginning, it's actually Deva Putra, which is like divine child. It's like a particular being. So where it says son of the gods, I think in English that's a little weird phrasing. So we say like Deva. It really is saying Deva Putra, which is like divine child. It's a divine being. In other words, in the Indian pantheon, divine child is one of the names of a being. Like so. Anyway, so I'll say Deva Putra. Deva Putra, ultimate truths are beyond all objects. You say of consciousness, up to and including objects of the omniscient, exalted wisdom possessing the supreme of aspects. They are not like what is expressed by it is an ultimate truth. And I'll read his commentary and then I'll explain more. So this quote explains that ultimate truths are not seen in accordance with the appearance to the mind of object and subject as separate when you say it is an ultimate truth. Therefore, the quotation is a source for the disappearance of dualistic appearances rather than for the non-realization of the ultimate truth by a Buddha. So what they're getting at here, I just want to explain this point, he's getting at a number of subtle points here. Okay, so this is one of them. And what he's saying, actually, is an interesting point. What he's saying is, like, if right now, when we're using these terms, right? So when I say ultimate truth, right? Each of us in that moment, right, has some idea. Oh, ultimate truth, emptiness, like that, right? And and if you check your own experience as you think that, right? There's some sense of dualism, right? Like I went like this. Oh, ultimate truth, right? Like it's over there and I'm here, and it's like that. Oh yeah. So it's like that. I look up if I'm thinking about something, But there's always a sense of dualism. Does that make sense for us? And we can't help that, actually. They say even for a meditator who's not yet realized emptiness directly, who's in a very deep meditative state, there's still if you meditate, you experience. There's a subtle sense of dualism always that's there. A subtle sense of subject and object dualism, right? And what they say is that continues, actually. That sense of dualistic appearance, we'll call it. Actually, according it's funny, right? Even in your dreams, there's right, like even I was this isn't Buddha's point, but I'll just say, remember, like it's kind of a weird experience. I remember when I was studying psychology, Carl Jung, a famous Swiss psychiatrist, he pointed out, he did a lot of dream work, right? So dream interpretation, and he pointed out, he said, like all the characters in a dream are, of course, your mind, right? But then if you think back to when you're dreaming, think, well, that doesn't seem like, like I was over here, and this person was over there, In the dream, there's a subjective sense, right, of dualism. So it's even there in our dreams, right? Whereas, of course, there's not some other person outside in your dream, right? But there's the appearance of dualism because we're so... The point of it is, dualism is so ingrained in our habit of how we perceive that it even appears in our dreams, right? It's actually always there, in a way, for us, right? This sense of dualistic, I and you, right? And even when we say my anger, right? It's like there's me and there's the anger, as if there's two separate things, right? My body, right? There's like a me and there. It's our habit that whatever we're, my mind, right? Whatever we're thinking in reference to, we make it dualistic. Does that make sense? And here, what they're pointing out is that for the person who's at the first, actually, you could say it this way, the first time we become truly, ever truly become free from dualism is when we directly realize emptiness. So you become what they call an Arya being, right? A noble being. And you achieve, then if you're a bodhisattva, you achieve the first bhumi at that time. But so, what they say is that for the person who's directly realizing emptiness, the experience subjectively is like, the analogy that Lama Tsongkhapa will give in this text is it's like water being poured into water. There's no sense of dualism. And they contrast that sometimes. They say, like, if you pour milk into water, first you can see they're different, and then if you stir them, they look like they're, what's the word? Totally mixed, but still those could theoretically be separated. But if you pour water into water, there's just water. Does that make sense? So the idea is that for the person who realizes ultimate truth directly, there's no longer any experience of dualism. There's no sense of emptiness as an object being realized by a subject. And what he says, this quote, like, it is an ultimate truth, in quotes, what he's pointing out is that as long as we're thinking that we have to talk about that, it's okay, right? He's doing it in his own text, right? There's no other way to approach it except for by studying, so we have to talk about it. And he's saying, but when you say it is an ultimate truth, that's not the ultimate truth, right? That's your idea of the ultimate truth, which you're thinking about dualistically. And when you actually experience the ultimate truth, you won't say it is an ultimate truth in that moment, because you'll be, what's the word, in a state of non-dualistic meditative absorption in that, where there's no sense of subject and object. And so then what he's saying is when they say then, this quote, right, when it says, now I'm going to go back to page 286 or at the bottom there, where it said, ultimate truths are beyond all objects. So some people thought that meant it's not perceived, right? It's not an object of perception. And he's saying, that's not what that quote means. Lama Tsongkhapa. He's saying, what that means is, for that person, there is no object or subject, experientially, right? Because it's completely non-dualistic, right? So it doesn't mean there's no perception going on. It means that it's a perception that's beyond subject and object, experientially for the person realizing it. We can still talk about it as subject and object. After that experience, if they are not a Buddha yet, they could say, oh wow, like they could think back about it and they'll have a dualistic. Actually, that's interesting. Like for a Buddha, there are no dualistic. We're going to get into that. Buddhas never have dualistic perceptions. But ordinary, like a person who first realizes emptiness, afterwards, after they've come out of that meditative absorption, they do have the thought, oh, I realized emptiness. And that's dualistic. Does that make sense? But if they go back into the direct perception of emptiness, their dualism falls away again. And then when they come out of it again, they think about it, and that's again dualistic. And eventually, only when they become a Buddha does that dualism completely get permanently eliminated. We'll do that. We'll do number 5, and then I'll pause. So number 5, how such a mode of perception is also set forth in the explanation of Chandrakirti's commentary on explanation of the way. So he's explaining that, he quoted the Buddha there, now he's going to say, here's Chandrakirti's commentary on this topic. So Chandrakirti writes, without touching produced things, he realizes suchness by making manifest their nature only. That is why he is called a Buddha. So he says, in the perspective of perceiving suchness with the Buddha's exalted wisdom, knowing the mode, meaning ultimate truth, reality is said to be realized without touching that which depends upon another. And so again, he's just pointing out, he's saying the same thing here, right? Which is that Chandrakirti is pointing out that for the Buddha's mind that's directly realizing the suchness, the ultimate mode of being, the ultimate nature of things, that aspect of a Buddha's mind only perceives in a non-dualistic way suchness itself, or emptiness itself. And that part of the Buddha's mind, or that aspect of the mind, doesn't perceive conventionalities, conventional appearances. Any questions up to that point before I keep going? I'm covering a lot. Is it okay? I don't know. Keep going? Sorry.
Dr. Lauren, what is without touching?
There, if you look below, Geshe Tupten Sopa says, without touching should be understood metaphorically. But what he's getting at there is without, like, actually it's an interesting metaphor, I think, that he uses. That's Tsongkhapa uses that metaphor. Because in a way, this is the way I think of it anyway, touching, right? Well, actually, touch is one form of conventional perception, right? So when you touch something, though, there's a sense of of subject. Like my finger is touching the hole, right? So there's a sense of dualism there in order to perceive. Does that make sense? Or metaphorically, you could say the eye touches. I mean, it doesn't literally go over and touch the visual object, or ear. That they meet. That two things are meeting, right? So the light waves in the eye touch, or the sound waves in the ear touch, or the pole and the finger touch, which is implying dualism. And he's saying here that aspect of Buddha's mind is non-dualistic. So there's no touch in that sense. There's no. It's like water poured into water. There's not a sense of one thing touching another thing. Does that kind of make sense? So it's not that sense. It's implying that it's beyond any sense of dualism there. So then item number 6, or sixth reason. The sutra statement that during meditative equipoise there is no movement of the mind posits there is no movement of conceptual thought. And so now it's getting at, remember earlier I was pointing out, we noted that there were various points that were made. And one of them was this issue of that some people interpreted non-perception or non-seeing as if it was not seeing anything, but it's not seeing the object of negation, therefore it's seeing emptiness. Then there was another part, though, which was saying the Buddha has no mind or mental factors, right? And some people interpreted that as if, like, the Buddha is sort of spaced out, or the Buddha is sort of doesn't know anything, or the Buddha, whatever. All these there are different ways you can interpret that. They're wrong, and here he's going to address that. And by the way, just briefly, mind and mental factors—that's a whole topic of study. But I just realized if we talk about I'll say 2 sentences at least, or something about that. So, because otherwise, you could say, well, what are mental factors, for example? And so there's a whole area in Buddhist teachings, Buddhist psychology, that talks about mind and mental factors. And the idea is this: is that there's they usually use different metaphors, like that. I'll say it this way: that mind and mental factors, when they say it that way, mind means the main mind, which is awareness itself, and then mental factors are not separate from the mind, but they're sort of qualities of the mind. And there are different metaphors for this. Sometimes they use the hand actually as a metaphor, that the hand and the fingers are not separate, but it's the fingers help the hand function, right? So there are aspects of the hand that you can identify, right? And then sometimes they use it like they use another metaphor, like sometimes they use this metaphor of a king and their ministers sort of go together or something. But anyway, the point is that mind would be like the main consciousness or awareness, but then awareness has something like attention, right? Is the awareness paying attention? It could have, and then there could be there are different types of mental factors. But
mindfulness.
Mindfulness could be one. Remembrance. There could also be anger or joy, love or compassion. Those are all mental factors that accompany a main mind. Does that make sense? So with all of those, there's always awareness there, right? But then along with awareness come other mental factors. And it could be sleepiness, it could be bliss, it could be fear, there are all kinds of mental factors. Does that make sense? And they always accompany, the reason why they use that metaphor of the fingers with the hand, or the, whatever, the ministers who go with the king or so. The point is that they accompany, that's the idea, that they accompany that main awareness. And so they go along with it. Anyway, we someday we can study if we want. There's a whole Buddhist psychology stuff. It's fascinating, actually, but anyway, so here it says, the movement of the mind and mental factors coming to an end means that when suchness is actualized, the movement of conceptual thought comes to an end. It does not indicate that the mind or mental factors do not exist. And then he quotes Chandrakirti's clear words. If conceptual thought is movement of the mind, suchness is non-conceptual, for it is free of it. As it says in the sutra, what is an ultimate truth? If there is not even movement of the mind in it, what need is there to mention letters? And then I'll read the last part now. The meaning of the statement that there is no movement of the mind is explained as the absence of conceptual thought. Moreover, in the explanation of Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way, it is set forth that at the time of an Arya's meditative equipoise on the path of learning, it has not come to a permanent end, whereas at the time of Buddhahood it has. So this is actually, I think, the number of, well, even, this is one of Lama Tsongkhapa's 5 great treatises on emptiness. So he's addressing difficult issues here, complicated, subtle philosophical issues. So, and what he's getting at there is this, is that he's getting a number of different important points. So one is, I'm going to start with this last point he makes, where he talks about an Arya's meditative equipoise on the path of learning. There, what he's getting at is bodhisattvas who have realized emptiness directly. Does that make sense? Not yet a Buddha. Somebody who's not yet a Buddha. And what he's saying is, for such a person, when they're in the state, like I was describing earlier, when they're in the state of meditative equipoise realizing emptiness directly, at those moments, those beings have no conceptual thoughts. And part of what they're getting at here, I just actually share this because it helps explain it, actually, I think, is how do we realize emptiness, actually? He's not addressing this directly, but I think it'll help us understand what he's getting at. So, at first, if you just study emptiness, right, like which we're doing right now, we're talking about it, you gradually develop a kind of a, what's the word? A conceptual idea, right? What's emptiness? Makes sense? And you might go, oh, it's like space. It's space is unobstructed, so it's space-like, but it's not space. It's an obstruction of. It's not a lack of obstruction. It's a lack of an intrinsic existence. Then you think, what's intrinsic existence? And then you start checking your own experience of what's intrinsic existence, and so on, right? And you keep contemplating it, right? And you start, what's the word? So you start with a very gross idea, right? And then as you continue studying and thinking about it and contemplating, let's call it, your idea becomes more refined. Does that make sense? But it's still an idea, right? Yeah.
Is the idea that you're talking about, are you referring to the same thing, like after the post-meditation state of mind, or no? Is that different conceptual thing?
That's different from what I'm talking about right now. That's what he's getting at, but that's not what, right now I'm talking about something even grosser than that, which is because that person's conceptual idea of emptiness that you're talking about is much subtler than ours. Yeah,
okay.
Because I'm just talking about a beginner, right? A beginner is going like, what's emptiness? And they read Chandrakirti or they read Lama Tsongkhapa, they get a very gross kind of idea. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
And then they actually teach us in the 5, because he's getting at this point about the progression along the path. So actually I want to say there are 5 paths, according to Buddhism, that you go through in order. So on the path of accumulation, one starts with a very gross idea of emptiness, like some kind of idea, right? And then as you continue thinking more and more deeply about emptiness, there comes a point, they say, right, where you gain a correct, valid cognition of emptiness through reasoning, which actually is humongous achievement, they say. But that is where the person is just thinking a lot. They keep thinking and thinking and thinking about emptiness, and finally they come to some kind of aha, where they actually get, oh, that's what emptiness is. Make sense? And they've correctly understood. They finally, like in a very deep way, correctly gained a correct reasoning consciousness about emptiness. It's totally conceptual, right? It's an idea. It's a hugely powerful idea. It's a power, ideas are very powerful, aren't they? I mean, we kill over ideas, actually, don't we? All the time, I mean, in the world. So ideas are powerful, and this is one of them. This is a powerful one nobody would ever kill for, though. You only love on behalf of it. The idea of emptiness nobody ever kills for. If you correctly understood it, you only love people for it. It's a good thing. But anyway, so there comes a point where you gain this correct, reasoned understanding of emptiness. And it's still totally dualistic, right? You're like, wow, that's an amazing idea, something like that. And then you start meditating on that. And eventually you gain calm abiding, right? And so you can actually gain calm abiding meditating on that idea of emptiness, right? So there's a subject, which is your mind. There's an object, which is that idea of emptiness. And you can gain calm abiding meditating on that idea of emptiness. That's still totally dualistic and conceptual. Does that make sense? But it's very powerful. Then there comes a point, and this is the second of the 5 paths. So there's the path of accumulation, then the path of preparation, which is the second one, is a point where you gain a union of calm abiding and special insight. So at that point, you would gain calm abiding, which is totally unified with that experience of emptiness. That's still dualistic, though. Makes sense? Your mind is incredibly powerful. You can concentrate for as long as you want in a meditative absorption without distraction on emptiness, for if you're such a person. But it's still conceptual. And there's still a subtle sense of dualism. And then on the path of preparation, there are these 4 there are 4 sub-levels on them. I'm not going to go through all the details because that's not our topic today, but the essence of those 4 paths is that the sense of dualism is getting less and less. That's what's important. Does that make sense? The sense of conceptuality, it's like how much conceptuality you have and how much sense of dualism you have are decreasing. You're getting more and more, it's getting more and more like a direct perception, but it's not yet a direct perception. And then there comes a point, which is the path of seeing, the third of the 5 paths, path of seeing, where all conceptuality falls away. All sense of dualism falls away. And the person has this experience that's like water poured into water, a direct cognition of emptiness, totally non-conceptual. That's the first moment of a non-conceptual experience of emptiness.
So on the conceptual side, does it have layers too, like progressing toward valid conceptual?
Up to the point where you have once you have the valid cognition, like I was saying, yes, up to that point where you have a valid reasoned cognition of emptiness, there are layers that you're taking away in a way. From that point on, it's actually a correct perception of emptiness. From that point on, it's not that you have to take away wrong ideas about emptiness.
So you could ideally invoke a conception anytime that you want to on emptiness.
If you have that, once you've realized that conception, then you can. Yeah. You might have to reapply the reasoning, but not so much. It takes less reasoning as the person. Yeah.
Right.
But anyway, so you get the point. So at this point on the path of seeing, the person has this first experience of direct cognition of emptiness that's totally non-conceptual. And so now we can understand what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here. So what he's saying is, for such a person who's achieved the path of seeing or higher, they've achieved this direct cognition that's totally non-conceptual, for that type of person, when they're in that meditative equipoise on emptiness, all of their conceptual minds temporarily stop because they're in the state of directly perceiving emptiness. But when that kind of person comes out of that meditative equipoise on emptiness in order to help others, in order to practice compassion, in order to give, in order to be ethical, in order to do other positive actions, at that time conceptuality reasserts itself and a sense of dualism reasserts itself. And they're influenced by that perception of emptiness powerfully. And they understand that things are empty. But for them, there's still this dualistic, like when if they're giving somebody food, they know cognitively that the food, the giver, the gift, and the recipient are all empty of inherent existence, but they still perceive them dualistically because they're actually engaging in activities. Does that make sense? And so that's why he says here, at the time of an Arya, that's that kind of person's meditative equipoise on the path of learning. So as long as they're not a Buddha, when they're in meditation, there's no conceptuality. When they come out of meditation, there is conceptuality. There's a sense of dualism. And then he's saying, but for a Buddha, all conceptuality is permanently stopped. So Buddhas have no conceptual minds, no dualistic minds. Everything is direct perception for a Buddha. Totally non-dualistic. And so now we'll go back. So then the quote about Buddhas have no mind and mental factors doesn't mean a Buddha doesn't have a mind, and it doesn't mean a Buddha doesn't have mental factors. They do. What he's saying is what it means is that the Buddha has no conceptual minds and no conceptual mental factors. That's what that means. This is kind of, what's the word? This is subtle philosophical discussion in some sense that I'm not sure it's a kind of very refined point or something, but that's what he's getting at.
Well, I find it hard to see how there could be a mind and a mental factor that is non-conceptual.
I guess actually, so one way of getting at it is that direct perception so that's the answer. I mean, what they say is direct perception can be non-conceptual.
All right.
And so Buddha engages in direct perception, not in conceptual.
It's not the perception part that bothers me. Well, of course it does. But what is arising when the Buddha is having thoughts and those factors, all 52 of them, if they're not conceptual, how can they be direct? Well, I guess, so there's a direct mental factor?
You know, I had the same struggle sometimes. Like I asked Kensei Rinpoche about that actually one time because I was struggling with the same question, and I said I brought Kensei Rinpoche quotes, like from the sutras where it said, the Buddha, what's the word? I can't remember the exact wording essentially, but the Buddha intended to benefit sentient beings, or the Buddha, the Buddha's, the Buddha thought now is the time to teach the perfection of wisdom, or something, and I was like, something like that, something of that sort. And I said, well, Rinpoche, here it says the Buddha, and Rinpoche and Kensei Rinpoche said he thought it non-conceptually, and I said, wow. I was like, but what his point was is that, I think what he's getting at there is that Buddhas do have, obviously Buddhas have awareness, right? So that's mind, right? But Buddhas also have mental factors. For example, they have compassion, they have love. Those are mental factors. Right? But their mental processes are different than an ordinary person. And they actually say this, right? There are various teachings that say Buddha's activities are, what's the word? Effortless, non-conceptual, spontaneous, totally spontaneous. They give these metaphors that are difficult to comprehend in some ways, but they say, for example, let's say this right, there are many metaphors like that, right? So first of all, the Buddha has awareness, right? But then they say, and the Buddha has mental factors. I'm just trying to give what were the analogies? One analogy is they give many analogies, right? The sun warms crops all over the place. It doesn't have to think, I'm going to warm this crop and I'm going to warm that crop, and yet it warms every single crop. That doesn't have something blocking it or something there are these various metaphors. They sometimes use the metaphor of the wish-granting jewel, right? That wish-granting jewels sort of grant wishes. But they don't think, I'm going to grant this wish, or something like that. Anyway, there are different metaphors they use. But the idea is that the Buddha does, definitely the idea that Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, because I'm not sure I can explain it better than this, is that what he's saying is the Buddha does have a mind, does have mental factors, but they're non-conceptual. That's his.
And even when he would be talking to you and giving a discourse on Dharma, it would be a non-conceptual discourse.
From his perspective.
From his perspective.
And we're going to get into that more in a few pages here.
Right.
Is that Lama Tsongkhapa at a certain point gets into our perspective and the Buddha's perspective, and that they're different. And I was actually thinking about that recently, because I was like, what does this mean even? It's actually quite, sometimes, the Buddha's experience is somewhat difficult to understand, of course, but, because they say when the Buddha taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, that, actually it's quite, anyway, I don't know, it's quite inconceivable, isn't it? Because what they say is that for somebody who is capable of realizing emptiness directly just with the syllable ah. They heard the syllable ah, and they entered direct perception of emptiness. So for that person, they didn't hear anything else. And then for somebody else who needed, you know, the length of the Heart Sutra, they heard something that length. For somebody who needed, then there are people who needed like 100,000 verses, and so on. So depending on what the person needed in order to be able to gain an experience, that's what they heard or something. And somebody else entered meditative absorption and didn't hear, so anyway, I don't know. Yeah, Buddha's, but you're correct though, that according to Mahayana Buddhism, and particularly this school, the Prasangika school, when the Buddha uses words to teach the perfection of wisdom, from the Buddha's own side, he or she is in a non-conceptual state.
But they can still relate to us from a dualistic, so they could see our dualism,
Yeah.
presumably, and they still understand that concept, even though it's almost like they're in an advanced state, but they could understand our state.
Yeah, that's right. He says that later in this text, actually. He says, a Buddha it's fascinating, right? He says a Buddha has no dualistic perceptions, but the Buddha sees that you have dualistic perceptions. So the Buddha doesn't, or from the Buddha's own side, the way he says it is that for a Buddha's own side, the Buddha doesn't have dualistic perceptions, but the Buddha correctly perceives that you have dualistic perceptions, something like that. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because I'm just giving it I don't know, this is my own reflection for a second, I don't really know, and it's not like a Buddha, obviously, but we all have some experience, don't we, at times where you're talking to somebody. We all have that experience, right? At moments where you're talking to somebody and you can see that they're they're in some state where they're sort of projecting something that's totally unrealistic, and you're not projecting it, but you can see they're, right? Like they misunderstood somebody and they think they hate them when they don't hate them, for example, right? And you can see, this person is perceiving it like that person hates them. They're upset and angry and hurt because they perceive it that one person hates them, and that person never hated them. It was a misperception. They misunderstood the person's phrase. You can know, the person said this and they totally misperceived it, what the person meant. I'm not saying that's the same as the Buddha, but it's like what you're getting. It's similar. It's a metaphor for that. Yeah. So the Buddha's like that with everybody about everything, though. Yeah.
If you get in the non-dualistic state, but you still you're still thinking dualistically, there's the real world. How do you stay in the other state longer? How do you erase that boundary?
Say again that point. So when you're in
Your point is the more you meditate and the closer you come to realizing emptiness directly,
Mhm.
you sort of erase the dualism. And so the question seems to, for me, is if you get in what you feel is a non-dualistic state, how do you stay there? Or maybe it's not, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. How do you erase the dualism of thinking there's another world that you're going to return to?
I think actually, I think there are a couple different. There are many different possible parts to an answer to that question. Is what I'm saying. Because one is, and I think they're all. If I think of Lama Tsongkhapa, what he says, they're all sort of required in a way. Because one part of an answer to that is, if one is sort of correctly perceiving, if a person is correctly perceiving emptiness in their meditative absorption, part of the answer in terms of those 5 paths, right, like that I was saying earlier, is one has to meditate over and over and over again on that, and develop deeper and deeper states of concentration on that, right, where one is more and more absorbed, you could say, in that experience. So one has to put time in, and if you think of like Tsongkhapa himself, that's why he went off and did the 4 years of retreat, then he did another year of retreat, then he did another, then he would come out and teach, and then he would go back and do another year of retreat, and then he would come out and teach, and then he would go back and do. And part of that was this experience of going into, he was doing it in retreat in order to get deeper and deeper, but we all have to do our own version of doing some version of that, which is spending the time on the meditative absorption in a way. But then there's another part to an answer, and I want to actually pull up a different text by Lama Tsongkhapa. Oops. in the three principal aspects of the path, by Lama Tsongkhapa, he says, here it is. I'll read a couple of lines because this was, I think, reflects Tsongkhapa's own experience in relation to what you're saying. Here it is. Okay, I'm going to read you I'll read two stanzas from the. This is from the three principal aspects of the path, which actually came from. They actually say Tsongkhapa wrote it, but actually they say that it came, I mean, he said, I guess, that it came from Manjushri. He had these visions of Manjushri, so Manjushri actually taught him this, and he wrote it down. But he says, because I think this is getting at the sense of the real world and the non-dualistic state, which of course is a dualistic, and so he says, if the appearance of dependent relation, which is unbetraying, is accepted separately from emptiness, as long as they are seen as separate, then one has not yet realized the Buddha's intent. If these two realizations are happening simultaneously without alternation, and for merely seeing dependent relation as completely unbetraying, the definitive ascertainment comes that completely destroys the way all objects are apprehended as truly existent. At that time, the analysis of the ultimate view is complete. Then he says, furthermore, appearances eliminate the extreme of existence. And this is a reversal, right? He says anybody who's not a prasangika would say that appearances eliminate the extreme of non-existence, right? Whereas when you have appearances, you can say, oh, then it's easy to see that when things appear, they can't be non-existent. He's saying the opposite, actually. He's saying, furthermore, appearances eliminate the extreme of existence. Does that make sense? And emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. He says, if you realize how emptiness manifests in the manner of cause and effect, then you are not captivated by wrong notions about holding extreme views. So that's his answer to that question in part, is that what has to, even like, I think you get his point. So like that what has to do so he's giving two different answers. I mean, one answer is the meditative practice, in sort of in equipoise, you call it, or in meditative states. But he gives this other point too, is that one also has to come to a point where the mere appearance of dependent relations, of ordinary conventionality, induces an understanding of emptiness. And the understanding of emptiness reinforces one's understanding of dependent relationality. And so he's saying that's the point where then one has realized the Buddha's intent, but also it's unbetraying, and that undercuts the dual. You can see how that undercuts the dualism. And so that's his answer to that question, I think. Does that make sense, Kevin?
So it's the emptiness helps you see the other world, I call it, but the dependent relationships in a totally different way. It eliminates their existence. I'm saying the words wrong, but it helps you see the other world in a different way, so that it's non-dualistic.
Yeah, or less dualistic, I guess, something like that. That's one way to say it. Yeah, and it's not, and it's not that and then I guess is the tricky part, right? What he's saying is that it's not that world doesn't exist. That world does exist, conventionally. And by understanding how that world exists conventionally, you understand that it's empty. If you really understand how that world exists conventionally, then you understand the way it exists is empty. And by understanding emptiness, it allows you to understand that world is a mere conventionality. Because when we talk about conventional also, this section actually is getting back to that anyway. He talked about when he got in the section earlier on conventionalities, he pointed out that there were two different ways to interpret the word conventional, in a way. I mean, one was deceptive, right, which was where you're projecting inherent existence, which is, and that is a truth that's concealing the ultimate nature, right? But then there was another way that he talked about conventionality, which was, he said, or there's also a way of understanding it as mere conventionality, right? Where one is understanding it as, and all those metaphors he gives, illusion-like, like an illusion, like a dream, like a reflection of water, and so on. And that's what they say, actually, that the person, those are metaphors that they use to describe the experience of the person who's doing what he's describing here. Which is that if they correctly understand emptiness, then, what do you say, mere conventionalities appear in an illusion-like manner for that person. Like a dream, like an illusion, like a echo, like a, or whatever, there are different metaphors, like a hologram, like a whatever, all these different, metaphors we could use. And I guess, and one point is that for that person, the more one gets that experience, they say, is that then one can engage with the conventionalities through compassion without suffering. And that was what, one day I asked Kensho Rinpoche, I said, like, so I was asking him, like, what's the experience like for the person who's realized emptiness and is engaging with conventionalities? And he was pointing out that he gave many points, but what he was basically saying was, he was giving all these reasons why for that person, they don't suffer. The world of conventionalities, the more that one's realized emptiness, the more one can engage with conventional side of things with compassion and without suffering, actually. Because the cause of suffering in relation to those appearances is undermined. That's another point. Yes. But yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa really emphasizes this point that understanding the conventional correctly leads to the realization of the ultimate, and understanding the ultimate correctly helps one understand the nature of the conventional. That's a big point for, and that's why he says here, actually in this last line, oh wait, where was it? Anyway, there's a point about the meaning of dependent origination. In other words, that dependent origination and emptiness are synonyms, is part of Lama Tsongkhapa's point. So there's not, and that's again it's a non-dualistic. That's heading in a non-dualistic direction, isn't it? That if dependent arising and emptiness are synonyms, then anyway, that emptiness is not separate from form, and form is not separate from emptiness. What Buddha said.
To see them simultaneously as such, right? To see form as emptiness and emptiness as form at the same time, as not two separate concepts, but it's the same exact thing.
Ultimately, that's the
Yeah,
goal.
right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a goal. I mean, again, though, I guess where I hesitate was, there's also this point, though, that for like he said, we're just here, right? For the person on the path of training, so there's for a non-Buddha, that when they directly perceive the emptiness of form, like when they directly perceive emptiness, they're not able to see form at that moment. But then when they come out of that, the idea is that they would see form as emptiness, or as empty and emptiness as form. But in the direct perception, they're not. Only a Buddha can do it simultaneously, directly. Yeah, that's the other point. Yeah. And for everybody else, we're trying to approach that, get closer and closer to that direct ability to do that.
That's the goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Lord, so when His Holiness Dalai Lama teaches, does he teach conceptually or non-conceptually?
I would ask, like, from his own side or from your side?
From his own side.
So
From my side, obviously.
Yeah, because from your side it's conceptual, or from my side it's
He
conceptual.
says he's just a monk.
Yeah.
But what would be your take on it?
We would have to say it this way, that like from the side of to the extent that the person in the audience is an ordinary person, then it's conceptual for them, right? If you believe, this is your own thing, but if you believe that so Dalai Lama is Avalokiteshvara, right, which is what the Tibetan tradition asserts, then you would have to say, and if you believe that Avalokiteshvara is a Buddha, because some people say Avalokiteshvara is a Buddha and some say Bodhisattva, it depends, there are different positions on that. But if you believe that he's Avalokiteshvara and that Avalokiteshvara is a Buddha, then it would be non-conceptual from his side.
But what do you think? Is it conceptual or non-conceptual?
Then you have to pick. Depending on your answer to those other questions, you have to pick.
So, this is my first drop in, and I'm kind of curious. So, so I keep hearing the word Buddha. So, and we refer to Buddha as a Buddha, but is it as a for a people like us who walk this path? Is there is a time frame when you actually become a Buddha, enlightened kind of? Okay.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Alright.
That
So that's
eventually,
so that's where we are referring to is becoming a Buddha.
exactly. Yep. Yeah, and that's the goal of this. Ultimately, the goal of the practice is for yourself, for each of us ourselves, to become a Buddha. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Should do the next. Do the next paragraph. So then he says, how the proposition that an ultimate truth is not an object of knowledge and such are nothing but wrong. That's very clear. Right. And you get the point. He's going back to that, because these are still what's the word? Refuting that other point, right? The idea that Buddha, it's quite interesting, right? Ultimate truth. I just want to go back to the way he says that. It's quite funny, right? It's not nothing but wrong, but he says how the proposition that ultimate truth is not an object of knowledge, right? So it's an interesting point, right? He's saying it's wrong. It would be totally wrong to say ultimate truth is not an object of knowledge. Of course, it's an object of knowledge of the Buddhas and of Bodhisattvas. But he's already answered part of the question, right? But it's not a dualistic object. It's funny because object could imply dualism, right? And we're using language. So he said it's a quite interesting point, right? In other words, ultimate truth is an object of knowledge, and we're using the word object because we're talking. But from their point of view, it's not an object of knowledge in the sense of being separate from a subject. I was pointing that out. Does that make sense? Okay. So then he says, apart from that, the explanation of Chandrakirti's commentary to the Middle Way establishes, with an accompanying source, meaning a sutra, right, that if the nature did not exist, the bodhisattvas would pointlessly undergo hardships for the sake of realizing it. And then he's quoting Chandrakirti. One may well ask, what is their nature? Meaning the ultimate nature of things, right? And then it answers, and it gives a list of, it's going to give a list of 3 qualities, right, of the nature of things, right? And remember, the nature of things is emptiness, right? That which is unfabricated about them, that which does not depend on anything else, their own entity, that is realized by a consciousness free from the cataract of ignorance. Whoever wonders whether or not it exists, if it did not exist, then for what purpose would bodhisattvas cultivate the path of the perfections? Why would bodhisattvas undertake hundreds of hardships in order to realize that? And then it quotes the sutra, it's the source for that. Child of a lineage, if the ultimate did not exist, pure conduct would be meaningless, and it would be pointless for the Tathagatas to come forth. Since the ultimate exists, bodhisattvas are those skilled in the ultimate. Actually, I'll read Tsongkhapa's commentary to that and then explain. If ultimate truths did not exist, it would be pointless to engage in conduct for the sake of purity of final nirvana. Disciples would not be able to realize it. It would be pointless for a Buddha to come to the world in order to make them realize it. And the great children of the victors, the bodhisattvas, would not be skilled in the ultimate truths. Thus, the sutra establishes that ultimate truths do exist, and is quoted. Therefore, it is simply wrong to say that the great master's system propounds that ultimate truths are not object of knowledge, and that the exalted wisdom realizing suchness does not exist in an Arya's meditative equipoise. So you see, based on all these other reasons, now remember, because I was putting out earlier, right, when we were at the very beginning, when I said these 2 quotes, one was, not seeing is the best seeing, and the other was, it's unknowable, or it's what's the word? Invisible, unperceivable, invisible, something like that, right? That if you now he's going back to that point, and he's saying, if you interpret he was that if you interpret those as therefore nobody can know, or it's never going to be known, he's saying that's wrong, and then he's giving various reasons. And what are the reasons? Chandrakirti says it's wrong. The Buddha says it's wrong. It's what's there to say, right? It is the perception of the person who's realized emptiness. And then he makes this point, right? If that were not true, then the Buddha wouldn't bother teaching, right? What's the point of teaching? In other words, if somebody can't realize wisdom, what would be the point of teaching a path of wisdom? And I want to go back. He also says he gave 3 qualities from the sutra about the ultimate, right? So one is it's unfabricated. You get the idea that, right? There's no elaborations. There's no, what's the word I was using earlier? Projection, right? It's unfabricated in the sense that one isn't superimposing anything, right? One isn't fabricating some nature. It's the actual nature. It does not depend on anything else, right? What that means is it's the actual nature of that thing, right? Form, for example, we were using earlier, right? The actual nature of form is emptiness, so it doesn't depend on some other thing being added to it. That's the actual nature of it already, as it is. And the last point he made was, how do you say here? Oh, it's realized by a knower free of the cataracts of ignorance, right? And again, the cataract, because cataracts is a metaphor, right? It blocks you from seeing, right? And here you have a wisdom, a knower, right? That's free of all obstruction, right? And so it's and I guess I'm pointing that out because what he's saying there, right, is that it's the seeing of the actual nature of things. Right? It's the seeing of reality. And what Tsongkhapa is saying here is that's, he said it in all different ways throughout this text, that one is that seeing that is the only way to become free of your own suffering and mental afflictions. Right? It's the only way to help others become free of their suffering and mental afflictions, right? Ultimately. And so what he's getting at is like, that's why, this, I mean, it's quite, I mean, you know, it's quite actually a key point. He's saying, like, so he's talking about bodhisattvas, right? He's saying children of the Buddhas, right? Children of the Buddhas are the bodhisattvas, right? And what he's saying is, if you have compassion, then this is the most important thing to see, right? Because compassion means you want to free somebody from suffering, yourself and others. If you have self-compassion, you want to free yourself from suffering. If you have compassion for others, you want to free others from suffering. And what he's saying here is like, to see that which is unfabricated, which is not made up, which is the actual nature of things, right? Which is seeing the reality, the ultimate nature of phenomena. Many times he said that it's the only way to, because ignorance gives rise to the mental afflictions, which gives rise to negative actions and so on, that if you want to stop that process of creating suffering for yourself and for others, you have to see that. There's no other door to liberation. For yourself and ultimately for others, right? And so he's saying here, so bodhisattvas make humongous efforts to see this, right? So to say, oh, it's like nobody ever sees it or it won't be seen or something, is actually quite an important point, right? It's like, it's not just an error, he says it's wrong, but it's a humongous mistake, actually, right? Like, and it's a mistake where then you would sort of give up and you would say, well, then I don't have to know anything or something. It's actually kind of nihilistic, really. And nihilism is actually, what's the word? You can actually see that, isn't it? It's quite subtle then, isn't it? Like you could start off by going, oh, it's unknowable. Right? But if you hold to that view long enough, then you stop trying to know. Right? And then if you stop trying to know, there comes a point where then you just do anything. Because who cares? Right? And then you hurt people. And you hurt yourself. So this is like humongous. It's a moral question in some ways. It's a question of suffering. It's a question of, like, it's actually the most important question, right? What he's getting at is you have to know that you can see reality, and you have to make effort to see reality, because that's actually like, what's it say, right? It's the only way to benefit yourself, right? If you don't, I mean, the more you distort, the more you cause suffering, and the closer you get to reality, the more you are free from suffering and free others from suffering. And so actually, this is a humongously important question, and that's why he says here, you know, and I began this day, this talk, with talking about Tsongkhapa's own effort to see emptiness, right? Where he kept like having experiences of emptiness and going, but that's not the final one, you know, and until like, and so he would study more and he would meditate more and he'd go out. Can you imagine that 4 years of retreat and then he comes out and says, I'm still not totally satisfied. You know, I think there's more. I think there's, or, you know, there's something deeper. I've understood, you know, and he wasn't somebody who hadn't had experiences, right? He had these deep meditative experiences of what's called like absorptions, where he couldn't be moved, and he'd had visions of Manjushri, and he'd had, you know, he'd studied with the greatest teachers of his time. One day he said to Manjushri, "Is there somebody I could study with other than Rendawa?" That was his main teacher of emptiness. And so Manjushri said to him, "Rendawa is the best teacher of emptiness alive today. You've already studied it with him. You know, practice, go meditate, go off and retreat, keep meditating. You know, keep practicing this, and eventually you'll realize it in yourself, and you'll know that you've realized it, and there will be no doubt." And my point is that that's what he's getting at here. He's saying that's what bodhisattvas do, because, you know, and so this other view that, like, this wrong view he's refuting, where somebody says, "Oh, not seeing is the ultimate seeing," must mean nobody sees anything, essentially, and that the wisdom is not known. It actually, what's the word? It's a small wrong view at the beginning, but it leads to a humongous result, which is you give up on the practice, on the path. And he's saying, whereas if you know, by not seeing the object of negation, you see something, right? Just like by not seeing obstruction, you see space. That by not seeing inherent existence of a self, you see emptiness. If you know that, then you make effort to see it. And if you make effort to see it, you'll achieve liberation. And if you have compassion conjoined with that, you'll benefit others. You know, so it's a very important point he's making. Does that make sense?
Dr. Lawrence?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm confused with, so, you know, I'm thinking the Arya and the Bodhisattva. So in that path of, so I'm confused with at what point does it just happen automatically that upon trying to perceive direct emptiness that then you go beyond just wanting to be an Arya and then saying, "Oh, I want to benefit." So I'm confused with how does one jump from that to all of a sudden saying, "Well, I mean, I know there's that Bodhisattva vows and all that, but
Like, how does that connect to compassion and bodhicitta? You mean?
yeah." So how does one jump along that path and then all of a sudden say, "Oh, you know." Kind of, is that part of the, when I realize direct emptiness, then I just naturally cultivate compassion in that process, and that I actually kind of experience that and therefore want to really be of benefit to everyone else?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So,
Does that make sense?
yeah, no, I get the question, and I guess I'll say, no, you know, one has to, like, if you think of, like, the section on bodhicitta in this text, for example, like, the idea in Mahayana Buddhism, which is, you know, the Buddhism of bodhisattvas, right, the path of bodhisattvas, one has to meditate on bodhi. Like, actually, just realizing emptiness is not enough to generate bodhicitta. And the example, and the proof of that, so to speak, or something, is that you know, practitioners of the vehicle of individual liberation, like, do realize emptiness directly, but they sometimes don't realize. I mean, some of them don't ever give rise to bodhicitta, or they don't give rise. They achieve arhatship, individual liberation, and don't realize bodhicitta. And so, the idea actually is that before, like, say a couple different ways, like, I'll say it a couple different points. Like, so one is that one has to meditate on bodhicitta, is the idea. That one has to train in that. Because we have the habit, and the problem is that we all have this, because of beginning this familiarity, we all have this habit of self-centeredness. And it's a beginningless habit, according to Buddhism. And even, it's weird actually in a way, like, even if you realize, if you don't work on overcoming that habit of self-centeredness and cultivating compassion, then what they say actually, it's an interesting point, is that, so somebody who, let's say, so they call them like the person who's not, let's say if the person is not going to practice the bodhisattva path, right? Like, so they're not a bodhisattva type person, and they realize emptiness. the first time. They're called like a stream enter. And it's an interesting point. That person, they say, does give rise to a lot of experience of love and compassion, actually. They really do. They give rise to it. But because they haven't worked on overcoming this tendency towards self-centeredness, they have love and compassion, but it's not strong enough to, so they do have love and compassion for others. When they see others suffer, they feel compassion. But their compassion is not strong enough so that when they realize that through their own wisdom they can just achieve their own liberation from suffering, it doesn't stop them. They just go ahead and quickly achieve their own.
So you're saying you could have self-centeredness and still be in a non-dualistic, you can experience direct emptiness, which is non-dualistic.
Well, the idea is that, actually, it's an interesting point, because good point, because in the state of realizing, while they're in the meditative absorption, realizing emptiness, just like this, there's no dualistic perception for them. So at that moment, they're not actually being self-centered. Yeah. But the way they talk about it, this interesting way they talk about it in these teachings, where they say for a bodhisattva, let's see this right. They give a point. They say, for a bodhisattva, when they're directly perceiving emptiness, there's no dualistic appearance. But that their perception of emptiness is influenced by their previous compassion. Whereas for the other person, they're also not having dualistic appearances, right? But it's influenced by their lack of bodhicitta. And the point is like, and I'll give it, they use this analogy, so I'll just share the analogy. Like, when you fall asleep, like if you, let's say it right. I'm going to say it this way, like, like when you go to sleep, like if one day you go to sleep and you think, it's the weekend, it's Sunday, tomorrow's Sunday, I don't have to get up, I can do whatever I want, and you go to sleep like in a very relaxed, sort of feeling no pressure, right? And then if another day, let's say you have a very early important meeting at work, that if you'd be in big trouble if you're late for it, and you go to sleep, then somewhere in the back of your mind, I have to get up, and that in both cases, when you're in the state of deep sleep, that part of sleep, you're in deep sleep. You're not thinking about anything, right? But somehow your sleep is influenced, right? When you start to wake up, sometimes like even though you're in deep sleep, if you're relaxed, you may sleep longer. But if you have a really important meeting that you're really worried about, like you wake up, you know what I mean? That it's somehow under the influence of that previous motivation is the point. So they would give that analogy. What they say is, when you're in the deep meditative absorption and emptiness, there's no dualistic, either way. But that, like, for the person who doesn't have bodhicitta, they're like the person who thinks they can just, sleep in or something. Like, whereas when they come out of their meditative absorption, there's not this sense of urgency to benefit others. Whereas for the bodhisattva, because they went into that state with not just compassion, actually, they call it the unusual attitude of responsibility, or like the special attitude. It's this like overwhelming sense of love and compassion and responsibility for the welfare of others, that still in the state of non-dual is non-dual, so there I get it. But as soon as they come out of that compassion, that commitment reasserts itself in a sense, or is there. And so it's like through that training, does that make sense? That they've so familiarized that with their mind that either way, when they're in the non-dual state, there's no sense of self and other. But it's like the difference is like that as soon as they come out of it, the one person who doesn't have that bodhicitta, is feeling blissful, I guess, is feeling joy, but the bodhisattva is also feeling bliss and joy, but is immediately feeling this sense of commitment and commitment to the welfare of others, essentially. And that only comes through training. So to answer your question, like that doesn't come about causelessly. That one has to, and there are two methods, right? There's the method of equalizing and exchanging self with others, or there's the method of the 7-point cause and effect method of recognizing all beings as one's mother in past lives. And so you can use either, or you can use both, you can combine them, it doesn't matter, but that to actually generate the bodhicitta, going back to your original question, you have to have practiced one of those two methods and develop that so that it's like, spontaneous, to the point where it's like your normal state of being, and it's spontaneous and it's effortless, that's how you relate to your life, in a way, to life itself. And then when you have that, then, yeah, like, it's like that. And I guess, and one last point, though, just to even like a detail in relation to your question, is they say that some bodhisattvas actually realize bodhicitta before they realize emptiness. Like, so they are fully realized it. And they say other bodhisattvas are getting more and more familiar with bodhicitta. They still have to have trained in it, but they're getting more and more familiar with that, but they don't fully realize it. And then once they realize emptiness, their previous training in bodhicitta becomes even more powerful, and then they realize bodhicitta. But in either case, they had to train in it before. And that's why actually, like, many times they'll say that, like, in the Tibetan tradition, oftentimes they'll say, well, like, let's say, right, you meditate on the points of Lamrim, and just going back to the actual Lamrim that we're practicing, they often say, you meditate on the Lamrim stages of the path up through bodhicitta, you know, until you gain really strong, and then, you know, before that you can think about emptiness, meditate some on emptiness, but it's then that one really then goes, like, does, if somebody's going to go off and do like long retreats on this emptiness or on Tantra, or it's with, they first should realize bodhicitta, because otherwise there's the danger of what you said, that the person would not, would leave behind compassion.
So, Dr. Lauren, what I heard, understanding the meaning here is bodhicitta is setting the motivation. It's doing the method part here.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but not necessarily you need that. Wisdom you can have without it. It wouldn't be as effective. You might be hurting yourself.
The idea, I guess, is this, is like, actually, the idea really is that what they say is that in terms of wisdom, understanding emptiness, that there are really there are two possible motivations, it seems. I can't think of any other in the Buddhist text anyway. Because it takes effort to realize it, right? So one is bodhicitta, you know, that's one reason. So bodhisattvas realize emptiness motivated by bodhicitta. But then, like, there are beings who are not bodhisattvas who realize emptiness, but their motivation is renunciation then. Like, so there is whether they're like they call them a hearer or a solitary realizer, right? So like a Shravaka or a Prajeka Buddha, that they realize emptiness motivated by renunciation.
But that's a difficult path because you're reducing yourself, renunciation, but the self, you always worked on yourself.
How do you
Arrive at a wisdom when self is so pronounced? That would be a difficult path.
I wanted that for a long time too. How can you overcome attachment to self without using
Others.
universal compassion?
Yeah. Wouldn't it be? I mean, from practical.
What they say, actually, it's an interesting point, is that it's like a, let's say this right, like, it's an interesting point, right? Because in either case, because actually it's related to what Tsongkhapa is saying here, isn't it? Which is effort, right? It takes effort to realize emptiness. That's what he just said, right? And part of the idea, I think, is that what he's getting at is that one has to have a powerful motivation to want to realize emptiness, right? And so, as you guys have pointed out, right, for a bodhisattva, that motivation is universal compassion, as you put it, right? It's this commitment to others. But for the, let's say for a hearer, right, they call it Shravaka, for that person, what happens actually is quite interesting, isn't it? Because, like, it's actually you know, if you think of their motivation, right, that person meditates deeply on impermanence, suffering, right, the suffering nature of samsara, and they develop this overwhelming revulsion for the process of suffering, right? And they understand, and they meditate on the Four Noble Truths, right? So if you think the first noble truth is suffering, right? The second is the cause, right? And so they gain, you can imagine, actually I just want to point out, like, because you can imagine, but it's interesting, right? Up to that point, right, when they're meditating on suffering, it's out of a kind of self-centered focus. Like, I'm sick of this. And they give analogies. They say it's like somebody in prison who's like, hates prison, you know, something like that. Like, it's really, the point they're getting is it's very visceral, right? It's like this visceral experience of like, I can't stand this anymore. I hate this state of misery. And so that person has this visceral experience of like recognizing the suffering nature of their own experience, this incredible aversion to that. Then they see the cause of that, which is ignorance, and they become almost, like you can imagine actually, I think one can imagine, right, where they become incredibly focused on like, I'm gonna overcome that, and I refuse. Like, it's like a person who's saying, I refuse to continue in this
Is that wholesome?
misery. And that's a wholesome state. Yeah, that's a positive state. According to Buddhism, renunciation is a positive thing. And I guess what's interesting though is that that person then does all these practices, right? Morality. And it's actually interesting. I'm just going off on a little tangent here. Their morality is different than a bodhisattva. I mean, they bodhisattvas and Shravakas, external behavior morally is similar, right? Like in other words, a Shravaka practitioner won't murder, and a bodhisattva won't murder. A Shravaka practitioner won't steal, and a bodhisattva won't steal. But their motivation is different, right? The Shravaka practitioner's motivation fundamentally is, I'm sick of suffering. I don't want to do things that cause me suffering. Whereas the bodhisattva, it would be unbearable, the idea of stealing from somebody, because you would cause them suffering, right? Their motivation is compassion. Not that the Shravaka doesn't have some compassion, but their main motivation is like, they would feel like, why the hell would I do that? I'd be like smashing myself in the head with a hammer. Like, that'd be so stupid. It's like that. That's their motivation, right? Whereas the bodhisattva's motivation is like, their main motivation is the idea that I would cause somebody else suffering is totally unbearable to me. I couldn't do it if I tried, because that would be utterly unbearable. So it's a difference of motivation. But then there comes a point, going to the question you guys raised, where for the Shravaka, one time I was talking, Ken Srimshay, we were talking about it, and he was pointing out this thing of like, it's going to your point. He was saying, it's a virtuous state that's motivated by self-centeredness at that point. But it is virtue because they want liberation. And then there comes a point though, where through their analysis, their meditative absorption, they practice morality, meditation, and wisdom. And then there comes this point where, like, it's interesting, what you're getting at though, like, it's motivated on behalf of the self, oneself. But then there comes a point where when they realize this non-dualistic realization of emptiness, according to the Prasangika school, they realize the same thing that a bodhisattva would realize in terms of the wisdom side. That at that point, like actually you can imagine, first of all, they feel unbelievable relief, don't they? Like, wow, I've gotten the antidote now. And what's interesting though is that they actually do abandon, at that point they experience love and compassion, they abandon the cause of suffering, and they feel incredible relief and bliss, I guess, at that. But because they didn't train before that point in responsibility, that attitude of responsibility for others, it's not there at that point. And then there's no basis, I guess.
Could we explain maybe, if you, in a Hinayana path like that, when you directly realize emptiness, you don't ultimately see any difference between self and other anyway. So, compassion at that point is compassion for what? There's no difference. It's the same. And there's a difference where a Mahayanist would see, well, ultimately that's true, but conventionally there is self and others, and I have compassion for others who are suffering. I mean, I guess that's the only. I guess that's how I can get that in my head. Because for a long time I've wondered, if you don't use compassion to eliminate your attachment to self, then how do you eliminate your attachment to self? But I suppose by investigating the aggregates of self and finding them to be empty, you could find and realize emptiness even without compassion. But it would leave you kind of in that sense.
Yeah, that's right.
And wouldn't there be compassion in the renunciate anyway, because it's a self-compassion?
Yeah.
It's just that it's a stepping stone to later developing other compassion outward.
Yeah, but what they say is that, for that person, actually, I know we have to stop, but I'll say very briefly, like, for that person, it's actually complicated, because for that person, if they're gonna achieve arhatship, they give rise to compassion, but they don't give rise to that special kind of compassion on their path, they're so relieved to get out of suffering that they're like the prisoner who sees the door open. They just run through the door. They don't go back for their friends to drag them out because they may get caught, kind of thing. You know, like so they just run. You know, so they don't want to go back, and they don't. And then there's this idea, though, that according to the Mahayana, I don't want to go. Yeah. So anyway, according to some schools of thought, those kinds of beings, it's like their final end is arhatship. According to the Prasangika view, so the Madhyamaka view, they say that those beings abide in a peaceful state for eons of time, but they say eventually the Buddhas come and tap them on the shoulder, wake them up and say, you have to complete your path, you have to become a Buddha. So the Madhyamaka view is that everybody eventually becomes a Buddha, but that it takes much, they say actually it's ironic, they say that the path through which one becomes an arhat is an extremely slow path to Buddhahood, because it's actually much slower, because there's not as much basis for compassion. But according to this school, they would say eventually even those beings become Buddhas because the Buddhas sort of ask them to or remind them to or something. So eventually they do in one sense, but they say it's actually much, much, much slower to do that. But yeah, so we should stop. So we'll do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezi, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.